Look, in no other area is the impact of restrictions on liberty felt more strongly than on a person's right to work. When it comes to work, we live in a virtual workplace regulation prison. And the prison walls are the 3,000 pages of workplace regulations. And we see our Prime Minister campaigning on a platform of jobs and growth. Everyone knows that employment is the key. And yet no attempt at all is made to remove the barriers and obstacles to people getting a job. But instead, all the effort, all the cost, all the expense running to billions and billions of dollars a year is focused towards building ladders over the wall. And for the low-skilled or or those who heard my little sort of 2-minute speech yesterday, for the low-skilled or the poorly educated or those lacking family connections or those lacking self-confidence, barriers to getting a job are are insurmountable for them. And when you look at this area, the contradictions and the inconsistencies are breathtaking. For example, you can work all week, 40 hours a week in an op shop store for nothing, absolutely nothing at all, and that's fine. But you can't do identical work in a retail store next door. You can't work for anything less than the minimum wage, which is $650 a week. There are thousands and thousands of people in Australia who work in op shops, the RSPCA, work in nursing homes for nothing. There's absolutely no restrictions working for zero, but woe betide you if you dare to suggest for working for anything between naught and $650 a week. If you're a young person on the dole, getting $5 an hour on the dole, and you see a cafe closed on the weekend because they can't afford to pay $40 an hour, and you knock on that cafe door on a Monday morning and think, excuse me, I noticed that you're closed on yesterday. Look, I'm getting $5 an hour on the dole. Can I work for you on Sundays for $20 an hour? And of course you can't. It's against the law. But if you want to go, if that cafe owner says, but actually next Sunday you can come around to my house and mow my lawns, clean out my gutters and weed my garden for $20 an hour, that's fine. We all think that's wonderful. Another inconsistency, if you want to become a nurse or a teacher or a podiatrist or a journalist or any one of thousands of different professions, you become a student. You become a student nurse, you get a student allowance, you become a student teacher, a student journalist or a student podiatrist or whatever. But if you want to learn carpentry, you can't be a student carpenter or a student builder. You have to become an employee. And an employee, and the cost of, and they call them, it's a 260-year-old word, what's it called? Apprenticeship, I think they used to call it. You know, it's so archaic. But if you want to learn to be a builder or a carpenter or a bricklayer, no, you can't be a student. All their friends, their brothers and sisters, all their other young people, they're all students getting but no, you can't do it if you. It's like I said, the inconsistencies are astounding. Back in 2005, when the Howard government came in and had a working majority in the Parliament, they should have just left Peter Reith's workplace alone and just allowed one simple solution to all this nonsense. They should just have allowed people to opt out of the workplace relations system. Now, I visited Canberra numerous times back in 2005 and pleaded with them and said, look, just leave it all alone. A lot of employers and a lot of employees, they like the workplace relations system. They like the minimum wages and the holiday pay and the sick leave. They like all that. So don't touch it. Just a one-sentence act of Parliament. Any natural person and a corporation can do a contract of employment, and you can just opt out. Now, you couldn't mount an election campaign against somebody opting out to do their own thing, but that's, of course, naturally they didn't take a blind bit of notice of anything I said. I mean, what would I know? I've only been doing it for 35 years. And instead, we got 2,000 pages of work choices, which, of course, we know what happened there. And from there, that led to 3,000 pages of the Fair Work Act that we've now got. To sum up, poor health, frustration, boredom, depression, drug and alcohol addiction, crime, domestic violence, bikie gang recruitment. It's the biggest source of bikie gang recruits now is the unemployed young people. Civil disorder, teenage pregnancy, even suicide are directly linked to unemployment. This is what happens to people when they don't have a job. Now, it's commonplace to suggest, oh, there are no simple solutions. Well, there is something pretty close to a panacea, and that is a job. Ted Evans, the Secretary of the Treasury, said about 15 years ago, unemployment is a matter of choice. So, on that little brief introduction, we'll introduce our first speaker. Phil Lewis is Professor of Economics at the University of Canberra. Thank you very much, Phil. Please welcome him. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that, Bob. Stole a bit of my thunder, actually. I've been researching labour markets for a lot more years than I can remember now. Sorry, is this not working? And so the origins of this talk today it's work I've been doing on several junior wage cases. We go back when unions have always tried to get rid of junior wages. They've tried to raise the minimum wage every now and again, and more lately we've had the penalty rates case and various other things to do with abolishing casual work, which hasn't received much attention, I noticed, in the media in the recent rounds of review of modern awards. So that's the background. I mean, while I've been doing this, because I have to appear in court all the time as a witness, so I thought this is a really stupid way of determining paying conditions. Having two barristers harassing an expert and trying to pick holes in everything you say. I thought there must be an easier way, surely. I mean, the obvious way is just to let employers and workers get on with it. And I thought, how on earth would you get to a situation like this? And so, anyway, it's just a sort of brief summary of what Bob's been saying about what the history of wage setting in Australia has been. It started early in the Federation, pre-Federation actually, was attempts to get rid of the industrial disputes, the quite fierce disputes that took place, the introduction of conciliation and arbitration, and the minimum wage, and we've had all sorts of things since then. Gradually getting rid of the importance of awards, I suppose, until work choices brought in the concept of workplace agreements and contracts. And then we had a reversal of that, of course, with the Fair Work Act, which put us back to before the Keating-Hawke days in terms of industrial relations. So, we go back, I say, the origins of the current system were in the early days of Federation, when there was a huge amount of industrial disputation, and so they brought in the concept of awards, which are a system of getting rid of disputes by courts telling people what they had to abide by, and they were called awards. And part of this, of course, was the infamous Harvester case, which probably most people know about from school. But the basic argument was that Australia at the time, remember, was hugely protected. There was a White Australia policy which stopped Asian workers, mainly Asian workers, from bringing down wages. There was protection of manufacturers to stop foreigners bringing in cheaper goods which would beat manufacturing. And so makers of agricultural machinery, because agriculture is a major industry, got huge profits. And so there was this idea you had to share the wealth around. And so firms that were making high profits had to pay high wages, and there had to be a penalty for those who didn't. And so you have to say, what's the minimum wage that people should accept or should be determined by law? And this brought about the Higgins case, where there's a lot of fancy language here about fair and reasonable remuneration, etc. And interestingly, there's a statement here, the standard of fair and reasonable must therefore be something else apart from what can be bargained by individuals. It must be something else. Cannot be anything other than the normal needs of an average employee regarded as a human being in our civilised society. So right at the very start was the idea that markets don't work, and it was necessary for somebody else to determine in the labour market what wages and conditions should be. And the other day I was just looking again, I was thinking about 1776 and the Wealth of Nations. And there's a very well-known quote from Adam Smith. It says, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own interest." That doesn't apply in labour markets. People can't be expected to act in their own interests to bring about the better welfare of society. Labour markets are different, so they say. And of course, we then had the introduction of penalty rates in 1919 in the Federal Gas Award, when they brought in 2.5 pay for Sundays, and again the statement goes something like this: "The extra rate for Sunday is given because of the grievance of losing Sunday itself, the day for family and social and religious reunion, and the day which one's friends are free, and the day that most valuable for rest and amenity in our social habits, whatever they may be." So here we go. This is the important thing. The norm of the work should be 6 weekdays and Sundays free. So penalty rates were brought in when the average worker worked 6 days a week and therefore was entitled to a day off. And if you didn't get the day off, you had to pay extra. And don't forget, these are gas people. They were stopping explosions in Melbourne, right? So we had to come into work. But you worked 6 days a week already. And then in 1947 we had the extra, which brought in Saturday, because Saturday was the day of sports of all sorts and recreation. The day by which, by common usage, had come set aside for individual recreation in outdoor activity. Right, so the current system had its origins in tariff protection, white Australia policy, and a paternalistic attitude. This is what the labour looks like today. In 1910, nearly 70% of the workforce worked in what we would call industrial jobs. In 2014, I could update this, not change it. In 2014, about 30% of employees work in industrial jobs. Huge difference in what people are actually doing. Part-time employment has grown from virtually nothing to about 30%. Casual employment, something again undefined at all until the 1970s, has now reached a peak of about 23-24%. Huge changes. Union membership, the guardian of workers' rights and pay, has shrunk from a high of nearly 50% to somewhere around 15%, and even less in the private sector. So we don't need people to tell us what our wages and conditions could be, okay, because we have a very flexible and free labour market, which consists of people working all sorts of hours, all days of the week, all sorts of different arrangements. Unions have very few members. Employment of males has fallen as more and more older workers are finding it hard to get a job. Younger workers are now working part-time as they study to get better jobs in the future. And of course the big growth has been amongst female employees. Particularly, nearly all that growth is actually amongst women with children. There's hardly been any change at all in unmarried women in the workforce. And then of course we have the education. This just shows you now about 72% of everybody stays on to year 12. See what it was. Even in the 1980s, that proportion was only about 30%. There's been a massive change. And if we took that graph back even further, we'd see an even more dramatic increase. And of course, females now the largest participants in education. And I could be controversial here, but I say on other occasions, when I've said when we talk about labour market disadvantage, we're talking about men. And more particularly, very old men and young men. And there we have enrolments in university and TAFE colleges there. Universities have continued to increase. TAFE's gone down in the last few years, and that's largely because there's been a massive increase in university entrance. A lot of people were going to TAFE because they couldn't get into university and seeking a second go at entry in the future. So, massive change. The demand for labour has changed so that we want more people with people skills, skills that are vital to the service sector, less manual work, less elementary clerical jobs. So when was the last time you saw a typist? You probably don't even know what a typist is, some of you. Those jobs have gone because of technological change. Structural change has meant the decline in manufacturing and other industrial jobs and the growth in services. So labour supply through people participating in education has adjusted quite remarkably to this change in demand. The growth in higher education is synonymous with the growth in part-time work. Two are matched together. And these are markets working. Where's the fly in the ointment? Well, I've shown you already. The fly in the ointment here, of course, is the unemployment rate. When I was a student, and this will be giving the game away a bit, if unemployment had got over 2%, there was a crisis. The norm was around about 2%. Look at it now. There has been a dramatic change in the labour market. There's been a huge change in the structure of the labour market, for which some people haven't adjusted. And now the Treasury says that an unemployment rate of 4.75% is the natural rate. You can't go below that, given your current policies. So that's what we've ended up with. And so I think, if you just take not just the unemployed, but people you could take various people who are now shifted onto disability pension, etc., you could get up to about 1.3 million people who want to work, who can't, at the current wage rate and given the current labour market institutions. That's the crucial thing. So they're the real losers. So how do we get round this? Well, the obvious thing is, if we want to, and I could point out here a few other things about how the labour market should change. When you look at attendance at sports on weekends, it's about 6 minutes on average, compared to 1 minute during the week. Church attendance has gone from an average of 45% down to very small, 15%. So if you're going to have legislation as to why people shouldn't work on Sundays or Saturdays or be compensated, remember they're called penalty rates. People have to pay a penalty for working on these days, but for employing people. It doesn't fit the story. It just doesn't fit. So what do you do about it? Well, we get rid of penalty rates, we get rid of minimum rates. How does that work? And here, you'd be surprised, there are a hell of a lot of labour economists who don't think wages are important. I've stood up in the court and I've been opposed by professors of economics who said there is no evidence that there is any relationship between wages and employment. It's the only good I know of where they don't have a downward sloping demand curve. If that were true, it would be a miracle indeed. But, okay, how does it work? I tell them how it works. I go back to Adam Smith. It's not the benevolence of the butcher and the baker. Firms aren't charities. Firms don't employ people because they like them. Firms employ people because they can make money. And they can make money when the revenue they get from that person's work exceeds the cost of employing them. It's as simple as that. So if you reduce the cost of employing people, either through lower wages or reducing restrictions like unfair dismissal, things like this, then people who are no longer profitable to employ will be employed. And what happens then, the other argument goes, well, if we didn't pay people extra for working on Sundays or public holidays, they wouldn't want to work. And I say, so what? If employers want somebody to work on a Sunday because it's profitable, they'll pay them extra. If they don't, it's not profitable to open and they won't be open. But it's the market which decides, not the institutions. So businesses would obviously be better off. I don't really think that they'd be much better off because the wage falls, because I think that'll be passed on through competition in lower prices. I think the big benefits will be in firms being able to reorganise the way they work so they can do it more efficiently. Consumers are the ones that really benefit, okay, because We know marginal cost pricing in a competitive environment. Okay, reduce the costs, gets passed on lower prices. And lastly, the economy is going to benefit. How do I know it's unambiguously going to benefit? Because extra employment only comes about with extra output. It is an equation. Firms employ more people because they're going to produce more goods and services. So GDP is going to go up and employment is going to go up. Unambiguously, welfare has risen. Okay, that's my stint. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Bob. And up until very recently, about 2 weeks ago, I was the Director of Policy at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And we, while I was there, represented some 300,000 Australian businesses, from the very large to the very small. Now, I've just returned to Melbourne to be with my wife, and I can't announce what I'm doing next, but something very similar. In the experience of the Chamber, which goes back more than 100 years, we have been the representatives of business, of free enterprise, and predominantly small enterprise, organisations without much market power, without strong connections into the political class. And that is, I think, the most representative group of the general market. It is the entrepreneurs, the people who take risks, who work hard, who employ. Good, honest business. And it's far too hard for them in this country to do what they do best, and that's provide the products and services that we all love and enjoy. Now, I'll just start by saying it's Sunday afternoon. I really appreciate that you're all here after lunch and you're being very attentive, and I'm going to resist the urge as an old martial arts instructor to get people to stand up and move around. But I want to ask you a question. And I want you to imagine for a moment that you have been appointed as a judge or as a commissioner of the Fair Work Commission, or what we used to call the Industrial Relations Commission here in Australia. Now, you have a case that comes before you, and I want you to think to yourself what you would do in this situation. So, you have a case that comes before you. It's a bus driver. Now, his job is to safely, you would hope, ferry the children to school. He's drunk, he's texting on his mobile phone, and he crashes the bus. What should have happened? Get the sack? You'd never make a good commissioner. No. What else? Be reinstated. The commissioner reinstated him. Okay, let me give you another example. You're a bit unhappy. You're an employee. You're a bit unhappy with your manager. So you push him to the ground and you kick him in the head. Okay. Anyone else? What should happen? Promote that man. No. Well, the very foolish employer who'd sacked him was admonished by the commissioner, and that person was reinstated. Can you imagine working with someone under those circumstances? Now, the list of shameful examples, on the ground examples that have really happened in real businesses, is quite shocking. And I don't need to go through many of them to tell you what an out-of-touch system that we have. Now, one of my previous jobs was to go and to talk to MPs, and let me tell you, they're not all as easy to talk to as Senator Bob Day, who, when I went in there to tell him about industrial relations, he really took me to school on industrial relations, and he actually has in his office the big physical pile of regulation. And as I remember you said to us, Bob, this applies to the employee. And most employees don't understand that this complex web of regulation is actually holding them back. And it's no more so now than it's ever really been. And Professor Phil Lewis has done a lot of work that we've used in our advocacy on industrial relations reform, particularly around penalty rates. I don't need to go over that, but I will say I've been amazed at this conference. There was a session about new technology. There's been sessions about cutting-edge developments, disruption, the changing nature of work. And if you go out there into what's called the Industrial Relations Club, it's like it really is back in the 1950s. And the system that we have does not reflect the changing nature of how we work and how we recreate. The system that we have now was not designed in the time of Uber. It was not designed in the time of eBay. And even a simple question like, what is an employee? What is work? This is a huge battleground, particularly for trade unions who see deregulation of the labour market as fundamentally undermining their position in Australia. They see the rise of independent contractors as being a threat and something that needs to be stamped out, much as the way that the taxi industry has responded to the rise of Uber. Now, what is the practical outcome of that? We've seen from the unemployment charts that unemployment goes up and up. And although the national average is something like 6%, for young people, it's more like 12 or 13% across the country. And if you look at very specific pockets, so if you get in your car and you battle the Sydney traffic, I'm a Melburnian, so it's a little bit better. You battle the Sydney traffic out to places like Mount Druitt, it's 20% plus. And all of the social isolation, dislocation, crime, lack of opportunity, intergenerational disadvantage that comes with unemployment. It's very much worsened by our industrial relations system, but it's not just that, of course. It's our failed education system. It's our failed social welfare policies. Very recently, when I was at the Chamber, I had the great privilege of bringing to Australia Dr. Arthur Laffer. Now, many of you may know Art Laffer as being the guiding light of the Reagan administration, one of Reagan's chief economic advisors, and the man who popularised the so-called Laffer curve. Now, he said something very simple and powerful, which was completely news to many of the people in Canberra, particularly in the parliamentary press gallery. He said, if you pay people who don't work and you tax people that do, what's going to happen? And they all sort of look at him with blank faces. Well, fewer people are going to work. And such a simple idea was completely revolutionary to them. And he, as a supply-side economist, also made some simple observations about if you want to get people into work, those jobs need to exist. So on the demand side for work, that's important. But on the supply side for work, it's even more important, because if those jobs don't exist, well, there's nowhere for them to go. So we've got to be really careful that those jobs are made available and that we're not pricing people out of the labour market with complex regulation and wage setting that's not just the minimum wage, but we have these things called modern awards. You believe it? They call them modern awards, which are supposed to mandate every element of the employment relationship, which the system, the premise that Phil was talking about, really does assume that you don't know what's best for you, that your employer is out there to screw you, and that you have no ability to negotiate on your own behalf, which we all know is completely wrong. And I look around the room and I see a lot of young and fresh faces. And I'm not as young and fresh as I was, but I'm still reasonably young. And to me, it just seems completely anathema that we live in a country where the sort of outrageous circumstances that I was mentioning before are actually quite commonplace. We live in a country where, although we are digitally native and we are very much in command of our own lives, we're not trusted to do something so simple like negotiate an employment contract. I'm not going to go on much longer. I think that was a little bit of an overview from an employer's perspective and how the system that we have today is completely out of date, that it's not suited for the modern nature of work, and that it has very negative consequences, particularly in rising unemployment and intergenerational disadvantage. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That's great. Our next speaker is the Honourable Ross Cameron, a former member for Parramatta. The Parliament and the Liberal Party still hasn't recovered from your loss, losing you, Ross. So, in fact, I think half the problem is when I talk to some of my colleagues in Parliament is that their eyes glaze over because most of them have never had a proper job. You know, and now seriously, they don't understand how an economy works or how a real workplace operates. And as we know, anything not based on economic reality is doomed to failure. And if we could just allow this simple little, because I never focus on the employer, what they can afford, and I only ever focus on the employee or the unemployed person who wants a job, is not allowed to work under terms and conditions that suit them. And if we could just drill that little hole in this system, eventually it will, as they say, collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. But more on that, Ross Cameron. Please welcome.
I likewise congratulate you for your attendance. Labour market reform, for those on our side of politics, is a bit like being a supporter of the South Sydney Rabbitohs during the George Piggins era, where the fans would turn up every week to watch their side lose. Labour market reform is a heavily defended citadel of the Australian economy. And that's one of the reasons why I am honoured to follow Senator Bob Day, whom I regard as a regrettably conspicuous, almost solitary voice, willing to challenge the shibboleths, the superstitions and the vested interests which govern the settings of the Australian labour market. I would also like to acknowledge Sam Kennard, who is in the room from Kennard's Hire. Sorry, self-storage, my apologies. Get with it. I will say of the, Sam is the CEO of a great Australian company. The biggest problem with Sam Kennard is there's only one of him. We need a dozen, we need 100, we need 1,000 Australian CEOs who are prepared to be here on a day like today. And frankly, I appreciate a voice from the sort of business chamber, but I would say one of the problems that we have suffered is a regrettably mute leadership class among the CEOs of Australia. You can get any number of ASX G100 CEOs to come out and endorse a range of other fashionable causes. But when it comes to creating freedom in the Australian labour market, we find a regrettable spirit of timidity. I would like to congratulate Uber. Do we have anyone from Uber in the room? I don't expect so, but I just make a couple of points about Uber. One of the things that we look for in governance systems that work, Bob says if it's not based in economics that works, it doesn't last. It's amazing how long irrationality and superstition can last. I had a guest in my home, quite a senior person, a friend visiting from Goroka in Papua New Guinea, and he told me that he hadn't actually told his family that he was coming to Australia for this week visit because if they knew he was away, they would be fearful about the risk of somebody performing black magic on the family and that he would not be there to ward off the evil spirits. Now, I'm saying to you that superstitions and shibboleths can take root in the human brain and last for quite a long time. When you look at the minimum wage, which is where I'm going to just concentrate my remarks today, and I appreciate I'm really speaking to the converted here in the room, and the more fertile question is, what do we do about it? But if we have to make the case, I would say there is virtually no government policy which is more qualitatively evil in its impact than the minimum wage. And its consequences are absolutely pernicious all over the economy. And the idea, as Bob was saying, that you can have a young person of relatively low skill, perhaps recently arrived from another country, perhaps not having English as a first language, that says, I want to work. And the Australian government is going to stand over that young person and say, unless you can reach this hurdle of $17.31 an hour, you cannot participate in the formal economy. It disgusts me. And when you then see the natural and obvious consequence of this behaviour, which is not only that we have, easily 250,000 long-term unemployed, more than 6 months. You've got 50,000 young Australians who've never worked. The impact on the psychology, of a young person who just looks almost like a waif, in a London winter, shivering on the outside of the houses, looking in at the family gathered around the warmth of the fire, with teeth chattering, longingly looking in from the outside. That is what Australian labour market policy does. It's been a feature of our story pretty much from the start. Paul Kelly talks about the Australian settlement as having the ingredients initially of the White Australia policy, protective tariffs, and centralised industrialisation and wage fixation. It's been there, this superstition, right from the early days of federation. And it's going to take a great deal of effort to knock it over. When you see a situation in commerce and government, wherever, where an obviously dysfunctional, pernicious, non-productive system is maintained for a long period of time, there is usually a reason for it, and the reason usually is that someone is getting paid. The system, the status quo, is benefiting someone, and that someone is prepared to fight to retain the benefit. And the principal beneficiary is those who are already in a job, those who are already members of the jobs club, and in particular, members of trade unions. But they are not the only obvious beneficiary. There is a vast empire of public servants whose livelihood depends upon the fact that their superior wisdom and compassion is required to help deal with this massive problem which the minimum wage creates. And they're all invested in it. Fair Work Australia, if there was ever an Orwellian name for an organisation, it's Fair Work Australia. Its work is so important, so critical to the nation, so vital, that the Vice President can take 9 months off on full pay without turning up to work. Has absolutely no impact on the productivity of the organisation. Improves it. Can I just say, whoever's contribution to that was absolutely correct. I believe that there is actually a very good use for Clive Palmer's Titanic. If we took, the 5,000 odd full-time trade union officials who run this economy, and we just say to them, look, lads, we're going to pay you your full wage just to sit on Clive Palmer's Titanic. We're going to send you around the Pacific, right? And you'll be able to stop in port once a year to visit your family for 2 or 3 weeks, right? But then you'll be sent off again. It'll be free, open bar, Australia's productivity would go through the roof. This would be the best investment we ever made. We should build Clive Palmer's Titanic. Every trade union official, permanent leave. Now, Bob touched on, what happens to these people? What happens to those who cannot leap who can't get over the moat, who can't get inside the citadel of work? They don't completely stop participating in the workforce, they just participate in the informal economy, in the black economy. And the truth is, if you want to take, some may say that this is a long bow, but I defend it absolutely. When you look at the question of radicalism, of national security, Sydney's long-term unemployment is concentrated in a few places, a few lumps that are very difficult to dissolve in Western Sydney and southwestern Sydney. And the ABS can identify it virtually down to the census-collected district where the levels of high unemployment are. In Bankstown, in Canterbury, in Campbelltown, in Liverpool. And you've got a whole bunch of people who just look out there at that $17.31 an hour and just say, well, I'm never going to crack. So I'm never going to crack that. So how do I organise my life otherwise? And, we see a range of consequences and results. I say radicalism is not as simple as, youth unemployment, but there is a hearts and minds battle of when a citizen of Australia is looking out on their environment, they're making a decision, is there a path for me in the legitimate economy which is capable of fulfilling my hopes as a human being or not? Is that path there or not? And I'm saying to you that the minimum wage is one of the most principal, threatening, intimidating, aggressive barriers to participation. I think it's absolutely shocking And the fact that there are not more, Tim Wilson was here, soon to be Liberal. The fact that this conference is not absolutely populated and filled in every session with Liberal members of Parliament is embarrassing to me. And so I want to congratulate Bob Day for showing some leadership here. I guess the thing that I want to sort of conclude with is to say, if you look at the ridiculousness of the fact that in Tasmania, the average house price in Tasmania is less than $300,000. The median house price in Sydney has just punched through $1 million. Rental markets reflect that disparity. The size of the average mortgage reflects that disparity. So the idea that you're going to say to a young person in Burnie in Tasmania with an average house price of $260,000, and you've got another person in Sydney who's trying to pay the rent on a property at twice that rate, and you're going to say to the employers in the two towns you have to charge them exactly the same minimum wage, is absolutely nuts. We know that one of the most beautiful discoveries of the human, the tool maker, is one 5-letter word for efficient allocation of resources, which is price. It's the most beautiful discovery. It's one of the things we love about Uber, is that the price can move to secure the resource required to solve the problem at that moment in that location. And here you have in Australia, we're still charging, $3.20 per kilometre to get in a taxi in Sydney. Getting an Uber vehicle in Los Angeles for 80 cents a kilometre. It's less than the cost of owning a motor vehicle. You have the chance to liberate people from actually needing to own a car. Talk about systems that work. If you go to the public transport taxi regulator in Parramatta, these sort of inspectors occupy about 3 floors of a city office building, and these guys are going out checking on the crease in the driver's uniform and the age of the vehicle and the odometer and, blah, 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 right? It costs us an absolute bomb as taxpayers to run this massive bureaucracy. And yet Uber comes up with 2 simple things, a 5-star rating for the driver and a 5-star rating for the passenger. It costs nothing. It's undertaken by the people themselves, and it produces a vastly superior customer outcome. Just for the record, I'm a 5-star Uber customer. If we are going to take this on, this vast bureaucracy of public servants, of community agitators, of taxpayer-funded academics who are all labouring with a bent back to keep in place this barrier to participation, I'm saying to you in this room, you are the true believers, this requires resolve, because they are heavily invested in representing any movement away from this minimum wage as an attack on the low paid, when in truth it is the minimum wage which is attacking the unpaid. And if we're going to turn it around, we've got to infect the major political parties with a willingness. Right now, there's hardly a single Liberal member of Parliament who's prepared to stand up and say the minimum wage is morally evil. They have been intimidated by this cabal. The trade union movement in Australia is dug in like an Alabama tick. These guys are going to fight for the rent which they are extracting from their entirely irrelevant legacy role in the Australian economy. They are thugs and brutes, and they play a bare-knuckle game. And do not imagine they're going to give this up lightly. So we need your resolve. We need your rationality. We need people like Senator Bob Day, because I can honestly tell you in my heart of hearts, I am not here to represent the interests of capital. I am here to represent the interests of those who have just arrived, of those who are on the margins, of those who lack skills, of those who lack a formal education, of those who don't speak English as a first language, of the women, of the refugees and asylum seekers. They are the ones who are being punished. And I just want to say to you that even though sometimes we may have that feeling, like supporters of South Sydney watching their side lose season after season, eventually, Russell Crowe will arrive. Eventually, The walls, after you've marched around the city 7 times, the walls of Jericho will eventually come tumbling down. And so I just want to say I plan to be there to see that day, and I hope you guys are there with us. Thank you.
Oh, that's terrific, Ross. Thank you very, very much. Okay, well, we've got some time for questions. So, okay, Malcolm's first question. And microphone, please wait for the microphone. And if you could, I don't want to be too strict on not making statements. We are libertarian. Okay.
So, John, there's a question for John Osborn. Isn't the ACCI, I mean, I'm glad to hear you resigned, but I thought they were part of the problem, and so if they're not, tell us why not.
Well, thank you very much for your question. Well, look, I would never disparage my former employer, and I left on very good terms. And I will say this, I'm not here to defend them, but I will say that we have, or certainly while I was there, been one of the strongest advocates for labour market reform, particularly amongst established business organisations in the country, and that there was a process. I'm not confident that that process has gone very far, but with the Productivity Commission that looked at the whole question of labour market regulation, and I think if you have a look at that submission, you will see first principles reforms proposed that really focus on improving productivity, efficiency, and it's in the subtext of it, but it's the individual liberty of labour agreement making and getting third-party actors, governments and unions, out of the employment relationship and allowing mutually beneficial agreements to be put in place and to be best suited to deliver employment outcomes for people and productivity outcomes for the whole country and economy.
2 very quick questions for the Professor. In WA we actually have you're taking out GST, we have our own minimum wage, which is slightly higher than the national one, because we have our own Industrial Relations Commission which regulates it. What do you think about that? Should we go into the national system? And the second sort of question is, I understand 93% of economists all agree that the minimum wage is basically a disaster. What's going on with the people at the Fair Work Commission where they keep, wanting to bump this up and keep this regulated system in place?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's really, it's no better having a state minimum wage than it is having the national one, especially most markets now are fairly national or international. I think 93 might be a bit over the top, because I noticed when labour economics is my area, there's a huge number of people who you would regard as fairly respectable, who still are very loath to admit that minimum wages cause unemployment. One of the few that actually did was actually Andrew Lee, who I noticed is remarkably silent about that. I don't know. It's certainly something perhaps about his integrity, but I won't. No, he was the one who actually did the case. He looked at what had happened to employment in Western Australia compared to the rest of the country when there was a difference in the minimum wage, and found that there was quite a significant employment effect. But it is still very much the case that's not. But the Fair Work Commission is, unless you've actually been in front of it, you've been in front of it. It's one of the weirdest experiences you could possibly. I mean, it's just like being in, one of those criminal cases you see where they go blood, right? And then somebody makes a point of order, and you want to go outside, you're not allowed to hear it, and you all come back in again. And somebody says, I made in that last penalty rate case, I think I made a statement like, clearly that people choose to go, would love to go out on a Sunday because it's a good day for going out for a meal or something. And I had to leave the court while somebody objected that I wasn't an expert on the people's tastes for restaurants. And then we all came back in again, and then somebody, and I said, well, because the argument was, it's irrelevant what day they're open because people just want to eat out once a week, right? That's the argument. So if they don't go on a Sunday, they'll go on a Monday. And I said, well, clearly the fact that a lot of restaurants are empty on a Monday shows you that people do have different tastes and preferences. And I've stopped myself from saying, then who are you to tell them what their taste and preference should be anyway? It is a different world. And so, it's, another hobby horse here, is this thing that's been growing about evidence-based research, which sounds fantastic. But when every bit of evidence that you get, you can find another expert who can say that's not right. means you get nothing done at all. So if you look at the transcripts of the Fair Work Commission, which are common record, but they are, they're all full of, so and so, Professor Lewis said that this, and then Professor so says this. Therefore, we can't come conclusively to the fact that wages are important. So we better leave it as they are.
Ross, Fair Work?
Look, I'm going to be, I may offend some people, but I think the Fair Work Commission is the greatest stinking pile of shit in the Australian economy. This absolute epicentre of employment creation in the United States at the moment is a sluggish economy. There's one state which is creating all of the new employment, and that state is Texas. The state of Texas in the 1940s, they legislated a very, very simple set of principles which say, in relation, for example, to trade unions, that the only thing a trade union can do is advocate on behalf of a particular group of workers. If you're a trade union official, you can't be a member of a superannuation fund. If you're a trade union official, you cannot take a source of income from anyone else except from the members of your union. If you're a trade union official, you have got to maintain a register at the front door of the union that any member of the public can inspect with the credit card transactions of the trade union officials. And if you're a member of a trade union, if you are a trade union in Texas, you cannot donate to a political party because you are regarded as having a fiduciary obligation to do nothing else but represent the interest of workers. Now, in Australia, we have seen the virus of the trade union just infect more and more deeply, just reach out unrestrained to infect and to reduce the productivity of more and more sectors of the economy. And the Fair Work Commission is a classic example of this conspiracy among the regulators to legislate to create a big problem, which is big muscled up trade unions, and then in order to regulate it, you need a big muscled up trade union regulator. And the truth is, there is this absolutely seductive quality to the idea that some commissioner in Melbourne or Canberra or wherever it is has got a higher wisdom, has got a priestly function to know what a fair, what a fair wage is. It is absolute garbage. And these people they are a succubus, they are a tick. They contribute no value to the Australian economy. We would be much better off without them. I have no respect for them whatsoever.
Thank you.
I've worked in vocational education and training for the better part of a decade. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on creeping credentialism and occupational licensing and guilds on labour market participation and barriers to entry.
So the question was, basically there's so many people now going through education, you think that we're actually, everybody's basically got a degree or a TAFE qualification, and what effect that's having on the labour market. Well, the big increases in the 1980s with the Dawkins era, and the rates of return to education, which are about the only indicator you've got really of whether you're over-educated or under-educating, that still went up remarkably. We did see signs, we can only measure these things every census period. In the 2011 census, we did for the first time see those rates of returns coming down, indicating that there might, we're not over-educating, but the returns to education are certainly falling. And yeah, and we've seen recently that the incidence of graduate unemployment's been going up. But when we talk about that, it doesn't mean to say they're going to be unemployed for a long time. It just means the queue. When we talk about unemployment, really there's a queue of people and jobs available. And when you get unemployment, that queue gets longer, and it takes longer to get to the front of the queue, which is why the people at the back with no education or skills or work experience stay at the back of the queue, which is why they become long-term unemployed. And that's largely because of the sort of post-GFC thing. But, get back to the point, yes, I mean, basically you have to have a degree. A degree's now become an entry-level qualification for a huge number of jobs. Anything to do with administration or the public service basically is graduate entry. And certainly you know, when you take the lower, not the lower, but the other professions, sort of like, if you call them profession like catering, cooking, etc. Again, you need those qualifications. And to be quite honest, I did a study on TAFE training, and basically, if you're going anywhere in the catering sector, you're better off not bothering going to get an education, because the returns to that sort of work are so low, and the work's pretty bad, and the career prospects are pretty awful. And so we are creating a whole set of qualifications that are necessary just to get any job at all, which again, of course, affects those people who haven't got one.
Just to follow up on that, thanks for your question, because vocational education and training is simultaneously one of the most important areas of public policy, but one of the most broken. And it's for two reasons. One is the often unnecessary credentialism that you've talked about. And we certainly see that in things like childcare provision. You know, childcare is outrageously expensive, so much so that one of the most pernicious and negative outcomes of that is that women don't return to the workforce because they simply can't afford it. And I've certainly seen that with my own staff. But the other is that you get this lockout of otherwise good and qualified people who want to work in industries. And the namesake of this conference, actually, Milton Friedman, he wrote his PhD thesis on an analysis of one of the biggest and ugliest unions in the US at the time, and that was the American Medical Association. And he talked about the way that they had used restrictive entry into the profession of medicine as a way of extracting rent, pushing up the prices for medical care, and ultimately depriving many people of the care that they required. So, and of course, that's not how they were selling their mission in life. They were selling their mission as improving standards and quality. So often the rhetoric, what my boss, the chamber, used to call the slip between cup and lip. You know, that is what we say and what we do is often so different, and that is a thematic that we see very regularly in anything to do with government. So you've got this credentialism problem, but you've also got the funding model is a complete disaster area, and that's true in vet, it's true, just to go on to my example of childcare, it's true there too. We just pay the operators more and passes the benefit on to them, and it's the taxpayers who ultimately end up paying for very low quality provision of services, and that's why we need the Uber for childcare. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Earlier on, so we acknowledge that our IR system has problems for over 100 years. But early on, you did show a graph from the presentation where it said that unemployment was around 2% in the 1960s. Now, I know the 1960s are a different time to now, but what I'm suggesting is that were we doing something less bad in the 1960s? Has it really got even worse? And if we just put the 1960s IR law into place now, will we be better off?
Yeah, I'm going to say to you, if you look, for example, at the importance of wool in the Australian economy, you know, in the 1960s, it was a big contributor to GDP. You know, interestingly, in the area of wool, the government introduced a minimum floor price, which lasted for about 25 years, and which turned the suburb of Yaguna in Sydney into basically multiple football fields of storing piles of wool. We got up to 4.5 million bales of wool. Until we introduced a variable price, which allowed us, to clear out the resource. Lee Kuan Yew said one of the worst things that happened to Australia was the coining of the expression "the lucky country," because it produced a kind of feeling in the mind of the ordinary Australian that we didn't really have to compete. And I just want to say that, the world we live in today is so vastly different to that world. One of the great impediments I think we have in the Australian political debate is a lack of visibility on about what is happening among our competitor nations. I recently made a trip to China, arrived at the hotel in Guangzhou at 7 p.m, had my first meeting with the head of the government agency that we were meeting with at 10 p.m. that night with his deputy and his deputy's first assistant for a 2-hour meeting at 10 o'clock at night on a Wednesday night. And he just sat down in front of me, a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and said, "Boss, what do we have to do to make this port more efficient? What do you bring to solve my problem?" And I'm saying to you that we are today, like the Australian Aboriginal, who spent 30 or 40,000 years in isolation, untouched by the changes that were taking place around this continent. Australia is behaving in a very similar way at the moment. There is a sentimental sort of looking back to wishing the world was the way it once was, and it is not. The average, speaking about education, the average Shanghai 15-year-old is fully 2.5 years ahead of the average Australian in literacy, numeracy and problem solving in 2.5 years. White people are going to be the cleaners for Chinese landlords in Australia, and that's at the track that we are on. And the education is really is this sinkhole for Australia at the moment. Putting your child in a public school in Sydney, I reckon is close to an act of neglect capable of intervention by the family court.
Thanks, Ross. Just one little anecdote from the 1960s. Apprenticeship wages and youth wages were 10% of an adult wage in the 1960s. They're now between 40 and 50%. Back in the 60s, there was no such thing as youth unemployment. It was a term unheard of. So there's one little example of at the entry point and the entry level. We're going to have time for one more question here from Darren, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
I just want to mention a great book by Eamon Butler, who heads up the Adam Smith Institute in the UK. It's called 40 Centuries of Wage and Price Controls. That's right, 40 centuries. Can things like history help us to better, get rid of these bad ideas on wage control, etc.? It's just a question for anybody who wants to answer this.
Historians on the...
Jesus...
That's more than 40.
Jesus quoted Deuteronomy, and he said, the worker should not be denied his wages. He also sought to link his more core message to wages, in which he said the wages of sin are death. But because wages was a concept that the average punter could understand. The Jews also say, for example, do not muzzle the ox that pulls the plough, on the basis that the ox is doing the work. So you ought to let the ox feed, and make sure the ox is not hungry as it's doing the work. I would say to you that Pax Romana, 200 years of Roman peace, which turned the Mediterranean into this massively hyping hub of economic activity, grew largely out of a Roman sense of freedom in relation to the things that we were going to regulate and the things we wouldn't regulate. And they said there's minimum levels of submission we expect to Caesar, but beyond that, we're kind of happy for you to speak your own language, we're happy for you to retain your own religions, and we're happy for you to do commerce in the way that suits you. You've got to pay tax, but beyond that, you sort of organise your own affairs. And I think part of the wisdom of the ancients was a recognition of the limits of what the state is capable of doing. And the great problem that we have today is a massively exaggerated sense of competence among state regulators.
I think that's great. In fact, I had an intern from Kenya in my office a couple of weeks ago, and she said that one thing she noticed was how much lack of freedom there was in Australia compared to Africa. How you were free to work, you were free to build a house somewhere, the lack of freedom. We tend to think of Africa as being despotic and so on. But look, that was a fan. We could go all day. If there's one, like I said yesterday, if there's just one problem that we could fix in Australia to have the most benefit for the most people, without doubt, it would be getting rid of these. I love that word, pernicious workplace regulations. So please thank the panel, Ross Cameron, John Osborn, and Phil Lewis for a great session. Thank you. Before we leave, I'm just going to ask and call on John Slater, who's the Executive Director of the H.R. Nichols Society, to come up and say a few words. Thank you very much, John.
Well, thanks very much to Senator Day and the panel. That was a fantastic talk. So my name's John. If you enjoyed the talk today and you want to know more about these issues, I'd encourage you to sign up to the HR Nichols mailing list. We're going to be doing a lot more work on this type of thing, particularly in the lead up to the election, on trade union accountability and governance standards. So we're writing a report. We'll hopefully get some stuff in the media, and it's definitely an issue that I think the Liberals and the LNP could do a lot more on. So yeah, it should be very exciting. So HR Nichols, you can find us on Facebook, get on the mailing list, and yep, thanks very much.
Thank you.